Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Monica Williamson. I am the Engagement Associate at SMU Data Arts. I want to start by sharing my physical description. I am a cisgendered African American woman, and I use she, her pronouns. I'm wearing a deep blue blouse with turquoise rimmed colored glasses and a red lipstick, and my hair is pulled back. I want to start by thanking each of you for joining today's webinar. Before we get going, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous community and all of the lands that we're on today. While we do come today in a virtual platform from different locations, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of which we all call home. From coast to coast, we acknowledge specifically the Apache, the Caddo, the Comanche, the Kush-Ata, the Tonkawa, the Wichita and the affiliated Kichi, the Waco, Taiwakoni, and the Lene Lenape peoples, upon whose traditional territories SMU Data Arts now exists. We welcome each of you to share your own land acknowledgements within the chat feature. Now for a bit of housekeeping. We invite you to utilize the Q&A for any questions that you have about today's content. Our team will be behind the scenes to assist those questions, and we'll have some time at the end of our presentation to answer those. Again, we also have that chat feature. We would welcome you to utilize that space. There will be multiple opportunities for engagement, so we do hope that you feel comfortable with utilizing the chat feature to share some of your answers to some of the questions that we have for today. And for those who are interested, closed caption is available. If you would like to activate that feature, simply click the CC icon located on your Zoom dashboard. You'll be prompted to view closed captioning by subtitles or by live transcript. And to preempt our most popular question, we are recording today's webinar, and we'll be sure to send you a link of today's recording for you to review again or to share with a colleague who was unable to join us. We are especially excited for today's opportunity to share some insights about the Michigan arts community. We would like to thank our partners, the Michigan Arts and Cultural Council, whose support makes today's presentation possible. If you could just allow me to introduce our next speaker, Allison Watson. She will deliver our welcome. Allison serves as the director of the Michigan Arts and Cultural Council, following 7 years of serving as program manager for the agency. She brings more than 20 years of expertise within the Michigan arts and cultural sector. Her other experiences include leadership roles at the Michigan Theater in Jackson, the Arts and Cultural Alliance of Jackson County, as well as program work within VSA Michigan, Arts Serve Michigan, and the Michigan Association of Community Arts Agencies. Please welcome Allison.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and taking time out of your day to learn more about the state of the sector here in Michigan. For those of you that are from Michigan, know that I love the data. I know that some of you might not appreciate it as much as we do, but today's presentation gives you all a look at how we are using the data, not just in those funder reports, not just to help us make grant determinations, but it truly is data that we're using to get a glimpse at or the entire scope of the impact that our sector has on our state. Today, I am so excited that the team at Data Arts has put together this presentation to give us that snapshot, looking at the last couple of years, and especially as how things are transitioning after the 2 years that we've all been struggling through. So I'm excited to be here. I hope that you all are as excited and will learn something about the data that you've been entering in that helps feed into these styles of presentation. So I'm going to stop with that so that you can actually get to hear from the main attraction of the day, which is Zannie Voss. Dr. Zannie Voss, thank you so much for being here with us today and doing this presentation. For those that don't know Zannie or haven't met her, she has been a featured speaker with us before. And so we're glad that she's back doing that. But Dr. Voss is the director of SMU Data Arts. and the National Center for Arts Research and a professor of arts management at SMU's Meadow School of the Arts and the Cox School of Business. She has served as chair of arts administration and arts entrepreneurship at SMU for 10 years. God, you know what? We need to stop throwing these numbers out, because you talk about 10, I can't believe that it's been 10 years that you've been at SMU. And then Monica, you were talking about me having 20 plus years of experience. I don't know how that's possible, because we just turned 30. So both of us. So we got to work on we got to skew those numbers a little bit. Prior to joining SMU faculty, Zannie was a professor at Duke University and the producing director of theater previews at Duke, developing and co-producing more than a dozen new plays and musicals, 2 of which ran on Broadway and on a national tour. She has served as a consultant to numerous grant makers and national arts service organizations. Zannie has published articles examining the strategic factors that influence organizational performance in leading academic journals in marketing and management. She currently serves on the board of the International Association of Arts and Cultural Management, the Dallas Symphony, and the New Orleans Museum of Art. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences Commission on the Arts. Again, welcome, Zannie, and thank you.
Thank you so much, Allison. And as Monica said, we're so grateful to Michigan Arts and Culture Council for its partnership in this webinar. Thanks to all here for joining us. I use the pronouns she, her. I'm a multiracial person with shoulder length, dark curly hair and brown eyes, and I'm wearing a white top today. Well, it isn't news to anyone here that the nonprofit arts and culture sector has been going through its share of hardship, hit hard by the pandemic and ongoing systemic racism, and it continues to face serious challenges. Can we have a quick chat storm? I'm going to ask everyone, use the chat function, and on the count of 3, if you would just share with everyone, what's your response to this question? How's your attendance? You know, are audiences, visitors, other participants returning in full force at your organization? And while you take a moment to just share what's happening on the ground within your own experience, I'm going to just share a quote. You know, the virus has hit our underserved community hard financially and emotionally, with a disproportionate number of family members, staff, and other community members. It'll undoubtedly take a long time for the grieving to end and healing to begin. This was an arts leader in response to an after survey. You know, as attested to in this quote, there's been plenty of hardship to go around. While you're reflecting on your own experience, I want to share some findings on how the pandemic has been lived by arts and cultural organizations really across the country. You know, understanding larger trends sometimes helps to contextualize local conditions. We're all ready for hope and promising signs of recovery. We're ready to move on. And yet we continue to feel the ripple effects of COVID, and we will for several years to come. So I want to ground us in thoughts of the future, but ground us in the state of the sector during this time. And most of what I share is going to capture the early portion of the pandemic, kind of through 2020, some into 2021. SMU Data Arts is continuing to update this information to more fully explore COVID-19's impact on the sector over time. And that happens, you know, for example, when you submit your CDP data through a grant application, which I know one is coming up in Michigan very soon. So we'll have more insights to share. And we'll first begin by looking at some earned revenue and attendance information. But before we dive in, Monica, can you let us know some of the reflection that folks shared in the chat? How are audiences?
So we have an array of responses. So we have seen spotty and low audience participation. Some folks have showed that they're looking forward to the summer, where they're expecting to see improved audience numbers. And partially, and some folks said that they are not able to report just yet. So a bit of the gamut.
Great. Well, let me share with you some information, just having that as context. Across the country, you know, earned revenue supported 14% less of expenses from 2017 to 2020. So gone from supporting 51% of expenses down to 37%. This is in 2020. Granted, first year of the pandemic, 10% of that 14% drop occurred from 2019 to 2020 alone. For organizations that are of, by, and for Black, Indigenous, people of color, the overall earned decrease percentage was only 9% rather than 14%. Comparing 2021 to 2019, tickets sold were 56% lower and ticket revenue was down 55%. And this is from some findings from our partner TRG Arts. So this is really looking back 2 years on. What we're seeing now is that the music sector has bounced back much more so than other performing arts sectors, and the theater sector much less so. It's all starting to come back. There's just still hesitancy to attend, and people have become changed in their arts engagement behaviors. Within the transition, baby boomers still account for most purchases, but they counted for 3% less of overall sales in 2021 compared to 2019. And the greatest growth has actually been in millennials, in Gen Y. So let's look ahead. In-person audience demand is down. We created a data-driven predictive model of ticket purchases to indoor performances using actual levels of COVID cases, ticket purchases, vaccination rates, traffic counts, restaurant employment, a lot of factors that were really influencing the things that were influencing people in terms of how they were engaging in engaging with arts and cultural organizations. Unfortunately, this model is still relevant. We're still facing COVID, and it's still having an impact. Ticket demand will downshift 20-25%, according to our predictive model, from pre-pandemic levels for the foreseeable future. Half of this drop is due to abstainers who are just not ready to return to performing arts venues indoors, and half is due to lower traffic rates and participation rates among those who have returned. So they're just not buying as frequently. We expect this demand suppression to continue for programming that doesn't allow freedom of movement, okay? These findings are reinforced by survey findings from Wolf Brown, who says that inventory and sales projections are going to be lower for at least another year, probably 2 years. There's also been a loss of the most loyal audiences, subscribers. This is pulling in from Colleen Dillenschneider, as well as our own research. Membership renewal rates are down about 25% when compared to pre-pandemic year. And revenue from subscriptions and memberships was actually a third lower in 2020 than in 2019. That's a huge drop. On the other hand, digital programming was a bright spot. That genie's not going to go back in the bottle. Think about your own engagement with screens during the pandemic. Putting down your device or stepping up from behind your screen is increasingly perceived as a high price to pay to engage with arts and cultural organizations in a live space. According to the Nielsen Total Audience Report in 2019, so this is even before the pandemic, pre-pandemic, before we became glued to Zoom screens and to Netflix, the average American spent an average of 11 hours and 27 minutes per day on digital devices. If you total that up, that's over 14 full 24-hour days per month behind a screen. And if people can't do this with you, they're going to do it without you. So this meet me where I can consume, where I consume mentality. Organizations that figured out a revenue engine for virtual programming are really humming right now. We know that screen usage only increased during the pandemic. That increasingly is becoming a revenue generator. And we know that BIPOC community members in particular are more likely to feel that arts and cultural organizations are important a year into the pandemic. This is from research from Slava Renette and LaPlaca Cohen. However, this rising sentiment is also coupled with a really strong call for arts organizations to become more relevant to people. Melissa Colley-Wolf with Arts Funder Forum had said that arts funding was in crisis well before 2020, but the events of this year have proven we can't wait any longer to reimagine our models for a more sustainable future. When looking at trends and acknowledging that the arts and culture sector has done a pretty awful job of explaining its relevance, I hope we can all agree that urgent action is needed. Melissa's comments are reflected in findings from Giving USA. So this is looking at 2020. It was a year when charitable giving in the United States broke records. It increased 5.1%. Individuals contributed 78% of that amount. And this is looking at private contributions. Americans responded very generously to the unprecedented events and challenges of 2020, with all 9 categories of charities receiving emergency funding for COVID-19 and racial justice giving. But with those record numbers comes a pretty serious gut punch. While 7 of the sectors saw growth, giving to the arts and culture sector declined 7.5% in inflation adjusted figures, despite exceptional relief funding. And these figures don't include government funding. So let's add in government funding and look at arts and culture. Unrestricted contributed revenue grew 3% just from 2019 to 2020. After falling to a low as a percentage of expenses in 2019, if we looked at trends, it shot up. Contributed revenue experienced a sudden reversal in 2020 and ended up covering more than half of annual expenses, 55% for the average arts and cultural organization. These changes in 2020 were much more dramatic if we look at organizations by size. So for small organizations, unrestricted contributions made up 80%, kind of a 5-year high in 2020. For BIPOC organizations, it was 82% on average nationally. These were highest levels in recent years. We know a lot of this was driven by increases in government funding. All 3 levels of government support were at their 5-year peak in 2020. Average federal government support rose 12% alone from 2019 to 2020. And these figures are before the shuttered venue operating grants. The federal funding initiatives in particular staved off, they were a godsend that staved off much of the predicted widespread devastation to the arts that was initially predicted at the start of the pandemic. However, I want to just remind us all that even within federal arts funding and relief funding, there were the haves and have-nots. In total, about 22,500 organizations received a federal relief grant from one of the different initiatives, totaling over $7 billion. So even if we assume that no organization received more than one of these grants, that still leaves out the vast majority of organizations who received nothing. Their safety net didn't materialize. And if they hadn't stashed away working capital or figured how else to bring in money, they're likely no longer in business. And when we think about who received nothing, our early research into the payroll protection program, the PPP funding, it indicated that many community-based organizations that tended to be smaller and existed to serve communities of color, in many cases, had a more difficult time accessing PPP funds due to fewer connections with the banking industry. And it was the banking industry that was processing the funding requests on behalf of the Small Business Administration. What's also happening now is a stronger flow of institutional funding to BIPOC organizations. It's a shift with many grant makers prioritizing equitable funding and racial justice, who they fund and how they fund. They're right-sizing historical inequities in funding, and that's really where the zeitgeist is currently. Funders are increasingly moving to fund organizations of, by, and for communities of color. Just think about the major America's Cultural Treasures funding initiative at $156 million, and the 7 regional cultural treasures initiatives that have emerged in areas around the country. These initiatives and others like them will strengthen the capacity of BIPOC organizations to build on their decades and decades of leadership and remain resilient and durable in the face of unprecedented economic impacts. Every dollar of fundraising expenses generated 16% more revenue in 2020 than in 2019. And for BIPOC organizations, this boosted return in fundraising was actually 21%. So getting much more bang for the buck in terms of investments in fundraising. And from TRG, we see that 3 out of 4 organizations received more gifts in 2020 than in 2019. And if you look at the gifts and revenue, you see that similar to 2019 or greater, or even a 20% increase was really kind of exponential in 2020. However, that 2020 boost in individual giving wasn't sustained in early 2021. Compared to 2019, giving was actually decreased more than 20% for over half of the organizations. So let's kind of put these together, looking at reductions in loss. post-recession march of growth, that there has been consistent growth in total expenses on average over time. That march of growth came to a halt in 2020. It shedded 13% of total expenses on average from 2019 to 2020. And actually, the 2020 figures were 3% below 2017 figures, and when we adjust for inflation. It's a good moment to really deeply consider right-sizing the budget. And this is the perennial tension of kind of the veneration of growth is good, the growth is good mantra, versus what are you willing to sacrifice for growth in terms of equity and inclusion? Think about the prices that you need to charge to attain growth goals, especially when sales are not what they may have been before. They're thinking about how will you show up as an organization and really what is the right size of expenditures. And I'll show in a moment that's actually less the case in Michigan than it is for organizations nationally, but it's a good point to keep in mind. Part of behind this is reduction in expenses largely came at the expense of painful costs of workforce reduction. Art sector unemployment has fallen to pre-pandemic levels only in recent months. We studied unemployment in the creative economy from January 2020 to January 2022, and disparities for those who were laid off or furloughed during the pandemic compared to those who maintained employment. Unemployment in the arts and culture sector was double that of national unemployment from the start of the pandemic all the way through May of 2021. So over a year, it was double the national average, like 28% versus 15%. It didn't return to pre-pandemic levels until just this past December. And Black, Indigenous, Asian, Latinx, and multiracial respondents collectively averaged unemployment rates of about 6% higher than the sector average overall. Whereas for white workers, it was 1% less than the overall average. And BIPOC creative workforce had greater spikes in the first 4 months of the pandemic. So they were the first to have job cuts made. You think about workforces everywhere. Some decided it was time to change careers. Some people moved out of cities. Our colleagues at Americans for the Arts reported that pre-pandemic, artists and creative workers were actually 2.5 times more likely to live in poverty than the general population. 2 in 3 had less than 2 months of savings, and nearly a third had no savings at all headed into the pandemic. And those who are people of color or with disabilities were the most likely to have entered the pandemic with no savings at all. So just think about being in such a precarious position and then losing all your gigs. That's a starting place, and that's what we have to really honor and consider as we're thinking about moving out of a pandemic. What kind of long-term impact does this have on the creative workforce? So if we put together all of these different pieces and look at these changes to unrestricted contributed revenue, total expenses, were the changes enough to offset earned revenue losses and end the year at break even? Overall, the average fiscal year bottom line figure for unrestricted funds relative to expenses showed a 2% surplus. Small organizations saw the largest average surpluses at 16%, while large organizations tended to break even in 2020. Small organizations, they suffered the highest percentage of losses in operating revenue, but many are really nimble, so greater expense savings. Those with missions rooted in a specific racial or ethnic voice had unrestricted surpluses actually of 13%. Now, if we were to only look at the average operating bottom line, not considering all unrestricted funds, we'd actually see a 2% deficit. So kind of right on that border, depending on what we are taking into account when we look at bottom line. However, once the relief funding ends and that Band-Aid is getting ready to be pulled off in the coming fiscal year and part of this fiscal year for many organizations, I actually think that we're going to see more closures by organizations that haven't been able to adapt. So thinking about adapting, thinking about how do you secure long-term financial resiliency, I'm going to talk about that ever sexy topic of working capital. What is working capital? Monica, can we do another chat storm? I want to do a quick chat storm on the count of 3. What's your answer to this question? Has your organization ever been cash strapped? And if so, what did it feel like? So has your organization ever been in a cash crunch? And how did that make you feel as an organization leader? If your organization has been cash strapped, you know more than you may want to know about the importance of working capital. You know, while few arts leaders wake up with excitement over the topic, many lose sleep over it. It's a measure of liquidity, and it represents an organization's unrestricted resources available to meet day-to-day obligations. It's basically ready access to available cash. You know, there are a number of different ways that working capital can be calculated. This is the simplest and most straightforward way. It's just unrestricted current assets less current liabilities. And that's what we're going to be talking about here. You'll also hear a lot of reference to months of working capital. It's a useful metric that shows how long an organization can survive at its current expense size in the absence of new revenue coming in. So months of liquidity declines when organizations run operating deficits, or because they encounter an unanticipated event of revenue loss, like a pandemic or increase in expenses. Before I go on, Monica, were there any reactions? What did folks share in the chat?
Yes, we have a couple of reactions. And so we have one response that said, yes, they had felt that experience and it felt constraining. And we had someone else that said, yes, it was awful. And then we had another response that said, not in the past 15 years, and felt fortunate about that.
Wow. That's amazing to not have had that problem in the past 15 years. Whoever had said that, congratulations. It is the kind of thing that, you know, trying to make payroll and not having the cash to do it and figuring out how you're going to survive is one of the most stressful events that you can encounter, you know, as an arts leader. So we're going to kind of tap in a little bit more deeply. Reflected in some of the comments is really similar to this quote from an arts participant and some work we had done with the Wallace Foundation on the alchemy of high-performing arts organizations. And the comment was made that liquidity, like cash flow, it sounds simplistic, but it lets you dream big and really think about strategic growth, which you can't do if you can't turn on the lights. It relieves the not sleeping at night issue, lets you get beyond basic needs. It's where resiliency begins. So I'm going to take you through a project that we had done initially with Rebecca Thomas and Associates that's looking at this notion of working capital. And we wanted to say from 2016 to 2019, pre-pandemic, when the economy was strong, did arts organizations take actions to build liquidity to levels that could buffer a storm brought on by something like a pandemic? And did the pandemic then affect liquidity in 2020? So what we're seeing here, methodology, is analyzed mean and median working capital for 1,113 arts and cultural organizations that completed the CDP every year nationally, and then organizations in Michigan relative to the national cohort. And what we saw was that most arts and cultural organizations across the country had inadequate working capital only 1.5 months heading into the pandemic, as was the case back in 2016. So no, they did not take advantage of a Goldilocks economy to build working capital. You see the average here of 5 months of working capital. This is the level of financial health. It's kind of misleading because it reflects a really high level of working capital concentrated among a small number of large institutions. Median figures, which show kind of the midpoint of the organizations in the sample, they tell us more about the experience of a majority of the organizations. And so why do we say 1.5 months is inadequate? Well, in April 2020, just as the pandemic was escalating, we worked with Jill Robinson of TRG Arts to estimate the effect on the bottom line of organizations 12 months out, saying, look, take a deep breath, what could happen 12 months out? So we turned to the data and forecasted for 1 year. It forecasted an overly optimistic outlook, given that we thought the pandemic may be closing in October of 2020 and organizations would reopen then. But even under that assumption, we estimated that organizations would incur a 26% deficit, which would come to 3 months of working capital in order to cover it. You know, thankfully, federal funding initiatives started up pretty quickly, state initiatives, local initiatives. But that's why this 1.5 months really we think of as being inadequate. During this period, most organizations ended their fiscal years near a break-even point, so pre-pandemic. They didn't achieve surpluses, so they had nothing to squirrel away. And again, this was during a Goldilocks economy. When we looked at 2020, although earned revenue all but disappeared, organizations cut expenses in the absence of programming due to the pandemic, and many benefited from COVID relief funding. So as a result, liquidity actually improved slightly, but it was still low in 2020. So going from a median of 1.5 up to 2.4 months. Let's look at Michigan. The median versus the average months of working capital overall in Michigan. And then let's also look at rural Michigan organizations. It's interesting that, again, think about the median figure tells us more about the experience of the majority of organization. So for the median, we said that regardless of location in Michigan, organizations had higher median working capital than the overall national median. So looking at these blue bars. Whereas the Michigan average, so looking at the mean, was actually quite lower than the national average overall. And since the mean and median were so close in Michigan, which is unusual relative to national trends, I dug a little bit deeper, and it turns that both the median and the mean budget size of Michigan organizations are considerably lower than that of the national average. Organizations in the state tend to be smaller than the national average. The median budget in the state is about $715,000 compared with 1.1 million nationally. When we look at average, it's even more different. The average budget size in Michigan was 2.9 million compared with 6.2 million nationally, with rural organizations being smaller on both of those metrics. And there aren't considerable outliers when it comes to working capital levels like we find elsewhere. Trends have been really similar in Michigan to trends looking overall, that bump in 2019 to 2020, increasing working capital roughly 56%, while decreasing expenses. So a higher number of months of working capital moving into the pandemic. A second research question is, how well prepared were organizations that primarily serve Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities through their mission-related work compared to peers that did not self-identify as primarily serving a community of color? You know, we know that the public health crisis has exacerbated deep divisions within American society, with Black and Brown communities experiencing far higher rates of COVID infection and mortality. So this examination of organizational health of the organizations that primarily serve communities of color is really key to making sure that these organizations, groups, communities are able to recover from support their communities throughout a prolonged crisis. Again, we turn to the data, looking at mean and median working capital for BIPOC serving and non-BIPOC organizations that completed a CDP balance sheet section in 2020. Overall, nationally, BIPOC serving organizations nationally were more liquid than their non-BIPOC peers, 3.4 months of working capital versus 2. But those in Michigan had virtually the same liquidity as non-BIPOC serving organizations in the state. We're really interested in looking at these differences and probing a little bit deeper. So if they're really similar, non-BIPOC organizations don't align in terms of the non-BIPOC organizations. They're more aligned with BIPOC organizations, both overall and in the state. So how are they sharing common characteristics? So I went a little deeper and just looked at budget sizes. And what we see here is that BIPOC and non-BIPOC organizations in Michigan are closer in size to one another than their peers nationally. And there was actually less of a gap. So the gap in budget size between BIPOC and non-BIPOC admission, the median budget is 30% different versus 41% different when we look nationally. The median budget size of non-BIPOC organizations in the state is lower than the median of BIPOC organizations nationally. And the median budget of BIPOC organizations in Michigan is only 68% the size of their BIPOC peers nationally. So these are some pretty big differences. And it's important to think about, well, how do these differences in size, why does this matter? It matters in part for working capital. And so keep some of these differences in mind as we move on to looking at, if organizations of color have inequitable access to revenue and capital. As other studies tell us, why do they tend to be more liquid? But part of it is small organizations of all kinds tend to be more liquid than larger ones. Here we see in trends that small organizations tended to have in 2020 5 months of working capital compared to medium-sized budgets, which had higher working capital than did the largest institutions. So that's one reason. A second reason is that BIPOC serving organizations are less likely to grow large. They tend to be smaller than the non-BIPOC counterparts at every size grouping. And that's true across the board, whether it's organizations nationally or organizations in Michigan. I think this is a really important point to make. Even in Michigan, where budget sizes are more similar, sweat equity, unpaid or underpaid staff and artists are kind of made to work until they don't. When these hidden but very real costs don't get counted, organizations can get penalized even further. They may not qualify for funding because they don't meet funder size thresholds. So they don't meet the thresholds to get increased funding or to get funding at all. Many BIPOC organizations have made great sacrifices to live within their means with limited access to cash from lenders and from funders. The resiliency of BIPOC organizations largely depends on their self-reliance. So having to have working capital in order to survive because it's difficult to get cash otherwise, and deep community ties. With that, I'm going to talk a little bit about fostering resiliency in these final minutes. So recommendations for grant makers: support recovery, reimagining, and rebuilding. We encourage funders to support grantee-defined strategies for recovery and adaptation. Place bigger bets on BIPOC organizations whose communities have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic and by racial injustice, and they may have recovery needs that measure in decades, not in 2 or 3 years. Invest in capacity building. Provide flexible multi-year capacity building funds for staff positions and salaries so organizations can address gaps in human capital, particularly in areas of fundraising and marketing, the revenue generating engines. Do this before encouraging them to grow, before encouraging program growth, more and more programs. Allow them to come to a point where their organizational capacity is stable. Reinforce new business models. As organizations emerge from the pandemic, changed or smaller, they're going to need a mix of flexible support offered for longer periods of time. And help prevent history from repeating itself. The pandemic presents grant makers with an opportunity to support cash reserves, in addition to funding strong programs once organizations have achieved reliability. For organizations, know your financial risks. Think about, can you afford a deficit this year, given your working capital levels? If one materializes, how are you to eliminate it moving forward? Prepare a monthly forecast of predicted versus actual cash receipts versus expenditures for the years. Be really intimately familiar with what risks are on the horizon for you. Develop scenarios for surplus. Come up with at least 2 plan Bs. As you're gearing up for gearing your programming up, consider how much cash you're going to need before earned revenue starts coming in. If the earned revenue doesn't start coming in before the expenses, how are you going to handle it? Adjust the timeline of your recovery plans, given your access to funds. Plan to redo your plans. Uncertainty right now is a given. Monitor your results regularly. Make sure that you have multiple plans in place, and know to reforecast as soon as you understand that the situation has changed. And then start setting savings goals. If you're having difficulty with working capital, sometimes the road to figuring out how do we get there can feel a little daunting. Assemble your board to discuss realistic savings goal. For example, if your goal is to one day get to having 3 months of working capital, budget for a surplus equal to 1 month of expenses in each of the coming years. And with it, I'm going to now turn things back over to Monica. And I want to just stop for half a second and say thank you. Thank you. This information, these findings, the different reports we do on working capital, the alchemy of high-performing arts organizations with a spotlight on organizations of color, all of this would not be possible without your data. And so I hope that you're finding value out of the data for the insights that it's been able to generate it. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your effort. Monica, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Zannie. I'm going to continue with the next step of our presentation, and that's just looking through the cultural data profile. We've gathered you all here today to share a bit of this research, but we also talk about how the data is collected and to make the case for the importance of extending this data set through 2022 and beyond, so we can understand how the story that Zannie has begun laying out will continue. And this brings me to just explore the cultural data profile and the data collection tools that it enables that Zannie just shared. So folks in Michigan have been contributing your data as a part of your grant application for many years. So I just want to walk through that really quickly. And first, it starts with the data that organizations enter into the cultural data profile. For those of you not familiar, the CDP, it collects end of year data on your organization's finances, staffing, and programs. As more and more organizations participate, our data set, it becomes richer. Our research team also connects your data to other sources like 990 data and census data and data about ticketing to create a model for the entire sector. And all of this together enables sector-wide research and tools that we provide. Here are a few examples of our research. I specifically want to highlight our ongoing reports. These reports focus on a few key areas of importance to many art organizations. They look at marketing, fundraising, the bottom line, and working capital and earned revenue. During our session, Michelle has been adding a number of links to some of those topics. And so we do hope that you do take a moment to read the research and some of the blogs that come from that research. Our research team periodically returns to these 4 topics as new data is entered into our system over time. We also publish an array of white papers. I'm just going to go back really quickly. These are just one-time explorations of topical questions, ranging from how to improve your organization's working capital to why the concept of a healthy organization is not the same for all art organizations. In addition to the field-wide research, we also have resources available that help you utilize your organization's data, including our analytic reports. And they calculate the same data points and metrics that we've explored in the other sector-wide research, but these are calculated just for you and your organization. Our analytic reports fall into 3 categories: annual, trend, and comparison. The annual report provides a summary of your organization's financial activity, program activity, staffing, and attendance. And this report can be a valuable communication tool to help you provide staff, board members, and external stakeholders with an overview of the organization. Trend reports analyze changes in your year to year, and they can help you understand how internal decisions and changes in your surrounding environment may have impacted your finances and operations. And the comparison report, that allows you to compare your organization with a group of peers that you create by selecting certain criteria. This type of benchmarking can be essential for understanding how to grow or how to increase financial sustainability or to achieve any other goals that you have. Both the trend and the comparison report are offered in different formats that highlight different topics, including financial health, program activity, marketing, fundraising, working capital, and workforce. Now, this is what the annual report looks like, and it's highlighted in the laptop image. This report highlights trends over 3 years and includes a percentage change calculation to help you understand. The report offers visualizations on some key concepts, and it breaks down your unrestricted revenue by source. This report includes financial data and programmatic data in the same report. And again, we're just highlighting the trend report again here for you, and it helps you understand how your decisions at your organization are changing. And finally, we have the fundraising comparison report example. And this report presents your organization's data next to an average and median for a comparison group. You can control who's included in the comparison group using criteria like budget size, discipline, and geography. This report looks at fundraising specifically. So here you're able to see key metrics about fundraising efficiency. Now, those are our analytic reports. I do want to share one more tool, and that is our KIPI dashboard. KIPI stands for Key Intangible Performance Indicators. The dashboard provides benchmarking scores ranging from 1 to 100 on 24 key performance indicators for your organization. The KIPI dashboard also provides a leveled playing field. You may wonder what that means. Before your scores are assigned to your organization, our researchers, they control for factors in your environment or about your organization that will likely impact your scores. I want to show you just a closer look at that. Here's the main page of the KIPI dashboard. Each colored dot is an indicator that will go into more detail, and the color codes signify your organization's scores. So how should you use these tools at your organization? They can be a great tool for communication with stakeholders. You can access formatted reports to share with supporters and donors without additional time to create each report. They can be helpful to frame conversations. We recommend touring the KIPI dashboard with a group to facilitate a conversation about areas of strengths that you can celebrate and areas for potential growth. The analytic reports and the KIPI dashboard can both be important planning tools. With so many day-to-day pressing questions facing art leaders, it's not always easy to take a step back and think about long-term plans and trends. A lot of the planning right now may start with taking stock in your organization's position to help you plan forward. These are the types of questions that these reports can help you answer. You may ask, how has the pandemic and recovery impacted your long-term financial position? And what does recovery look like for your organization? What revenue streams have carried us through the past few years? And how does that compare to our peers? If we've pivoted to online programming, how has that affected the size of our audience and the balance between free and paid attendance? Now, before we wrap up and take some last minute questions, I do want to share a bit of a plug of our upcoming training sessions that we have planned. We'll be offering a Getting Started with the Cultural Data Profile webinar, and that's for all organizations, and that'll be next month. If you're in the process of entering your data or you will be entering your data soon, this webinar is a great overview about the process, and it'll also introduce you to some helpful tips as you enter your data. Tomorrow and also in June, we will offer our monthly webinar about data at work. And this webinar provides a more in-depth walkthrough of the analytic tools that I've just mentioned. So a deep dive in where to find all of those analytic reports and more information about the KIPI dashboard. And we'll be sure to include a link of our events calendar where you'll be able to see what's happening during the month and register for any sessions that you find interesting. With that, I'm going to shift back to Zannie to help us answer some questions that may have come in during our time. So at this point, I do hope that you all will utilize that chat or Q&A feature to drop in some questions about today's research or about the topics that we've mentioned. And I'll shift it back to Zannie. It doesn't look like we've had any questions so far, but I'll shift it back to you.
I'm just curious if there are other experiences within your organization, aside from working capital and the attendance that I asked about, with respect to contributed revenue, use the chat function just to share with peers of how's it going. You know, is your individual giving kind of on par with what it was in 2019 and 2020? Has it grown? Has it declined? If your organization did not receive federal emergency relief, how have you gotten by? I'm interested, so we look at the numbers, but I'm interested in hearing some of the stories behind the numbers and what the experience is for those of you who are kind of on the front lines serving your communities.
And Zannie, as some of those stories come in, I want to encourage folks to stay connected with us so that we can continue this conversation. So we hope that you either text Data Arts at 22828, and that's going to help you stay up to date on updated reports and events. And we hope that you continue to tag us in social media. And again, Zannie is opening the door for us to hear your stories. And so we are interested in learning more as well. So I just wanted to plug that as folks are sharing comments.
And if you prefer not to share through chat, but something does come to mind, please say, feel free to send me an email at zvoss@smu.edu. There are a couple of comments coming in. Let's see. Gary, you say BIPOC organizations are smaller than their peers in similar budget sizes. Do you see any reason why that is? I think it goes to the second point that I had said. I think historically, BIPOC organizations have not had the same access to funding. And I look at it as, you know, when you are serving, and this is not across the board, but if I'm an organization that's serving a community that perhaps doesn't have a similar level of wealth, you know, let's say that I'm serving perhaps a community of first generation, you know, immigrants who have come to the country and they haven't been able to build wealth yet. And that's a really critical part of my mission. And at the same time, I can't expect for the community to be able to pay similar ticket prices or provide individual contributions that a wider, wealthier community may be able to support. At the same time, if institutional funders historically haven't come to supplant that like they would in other nonprofit sectors, I mean, usually you think funders are there to be able to help support organizations that are serving communities that are not necessarily able to pay full market price for engagement. And yet that hasn't happened historically within the funding community for BIPOC organizations. And so that's compounded by the fact that there is a lot of donated space. There's a lot of unpaid or underpaid workers. There's a pressure on organizational capacity. And it creates this vicious cycle of not having all of that effort and energy counted when it comes to finances. And so oftentimes you're not qualified to apply to the same funding levels to a funder. You know, we're starting to see some of that shift. But I think all of these different pressures have really served as barriers to growth. And it's not to say that all organizations have wanted to grow, but for those that do want to grow, they haven't been able to have the same level of agency to do so as their peers. And I'm happy to share, we had done a project with Wallace Foundation, the Alchemy of High Performing Arts Organizations of Color. And in that report, you'll find, not in my words, but in the words of individuals who are running the organizations, what do they see as some of the greatest headwinds that have kept them capacity strapped? Let's see, I'm looking at Rebecca. Oh, yes. Wow.
Two comments that have come in as you were sharing your answers on.
Mm-hmm. And Gary, I would encourage you, if this has been, you know, your experience, to share that as well with the group. If there have been particular pressures that you feel have kept BIPOC organizations smaller, if there's something that I didn't bring up that you think really deserves mentioning, Wow, that must have been tough opening up a new center in a pandemic, just increasing fixed costs at a time where you're not able to bring in the revenue to cover it. I have not really been seeing grant makers step in with a specific help to organizations that have not been able to get their attendance back on par. Was on a panel in New York last week with a group of organizations and a couple of funders who were also talking about this issue. It's a critical issue around the country right now. And again, I think it's particularly focused on organizations that provide in-person programming in a kind of space where people don't have fluidity of movement. People they're reluctant still to get back in the same numbers as they were pre-pandemic, to sitting close to each other in a space where they can't get up and move around.
No, Zannie, all of this is very great. There is one last question, and that'll probably be our last one for the hour. And that's the BIPOC barriers, you note, are very similar to our Northern Michigan rural region and our very under-resourced art service organization. Any suggestions or strategy using your data or other?
You know, I would encourage organizations to take advantage of opportunities to report in-kind labor, to use narrative space to make sure that funders understand that the capacity constraints are the work gets done, but usually with a larger use of volunteers. You know, how are you helping to tell your own story about the ways that unpaid or underpaid labor are really helping to drive what are the hidden aspects of your budget that may not be counted otherwise. And I think in many respects, this has been a good moment for nimbleness for organizations that didn't have a lot of fixed costs. They were able to survive. You know, thinking through how do you emerge from a pandemic like this, you know, making sure that organizations that have been extremely and profoundly relevant to their communities and serve their communities throughout a pandemic are given the attention that they deserve from grant makers. And that the grant maker focus doesn't just push organizations to take on more and more programmatic efforts during this time, but focuses on organizations that have had capacity constraints with unrestricted funding to nourish getting those constraints to a place where the organizational leaders are able to do the good work that they know they can do. And oftentimes that means just having a bit more hands on deck, having the staff capacity, having the ability to pay people something, and being able to kind of write some of the expense reductions that occurred during the pandemic to get you back to a fully functioning level before saying, and now can you increase programming?
Thank you so much, Zannie, for answering some of those questions and acknowledging the amazing work that our participants were able to share with us today. That is going to conclude our time together. I just want to take a moment to thank each of you for spending an hour with us to review this research. I also want to share a special thank you to Allison and the Michigan Arts and Cultural Council. Zannie, would you like to end us with your thanks as well?
Of course. I greatly appreciate your participation, not only in coming today, but sharing your thoughts, your experiences through the chat. As I said before, please feel free to email me anytime. We look at the data, you live it. So it's important that we understand how we can be of service to you. Help us to know where you would like us to shine a light in terms of the kinds of research that we do. And as Monica said, a huge shout out to Allison and to Michigan Arts and Cultural Council. Thank you.
Thank you to each of you. We will be closing our webinar space. Thank you again for joining us. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we hope that you stay connected. Have a good one. Bye-bye.